In Worth v. Selden, the court would not even consider whether a wealthy suburb, Penfield's, zoning policies were not only excluding the poor there, but were killing the market for affordable housing in nearby Rochester. And in San Antonio School District versus Rodriguez, the court denied that education is a fundamental right, or that states have any obligation to change school funding policies that favor the tax status of wealthy communities over poor ones. In all of these examples, the court saw nothing constitutionally amiss about people voluntarily taking advantage of the benefits available on the other side of jurisdictional boundaries. And this process is often referred to as white flight, and it was. But for our purposes, it is probably more accurate to think of it as political fragmentation, colorblind resegregation, environmental sprawl, and the late beginning of the end. Why was it so problematic? Because it was based on the same assumptions of independence and interlocal competition that are dooming our budgets today. The proliferation of walled-in local governments desperately seeking a tax base would necessarily produce winners and losers. Winners and losers would follow familiar patterns. The winner residents of a losing municipality would leave for a winning municipality, hastening the decline of the losing municipality. And as municipalities became responsible for more and more public services, as costs increased and their independent fiscal authority was overmatched by demand, they would grow into larger, often contiguous islands of undesirable space, now inhabited by less desirable people, while more mobile residents moved farther out or back into cities. And this dynamic lies at the heart of our current crises in infrastructure costs, public education, affordable housing, public health, foreclosure-related tax losses, and the provision of basic public services. Myron Orfield will talk next about how this dynamic has affected this particular region, but the national research strongly indicates that the patterns I've just described, patterns based on the twin ideas of local control and exclusion, have converged to threaten the very structure of local government and finance. The system produces a market for concentrated wealth, concentrated poverty, and a good deal of stress in between. So before I conclude, let me return to those three core assumptions of middle-class life in the United States: self-sufficiency, social distance from the poor, and voluntary segregation. What the history shows is that rather than being self-sufficient, the middle class, like most people, have been dependent on a host of government programs and subsidies, which is not necessarily a bad thing, and without which many opportunities simply would not have been possible. However, those supports are rapidly eroding, along with the economic opportunities that people have grown accustomed to. Federally insured mortgages, preferential tax deductions, the GI Bill, and other government innovations once constituted the public production of the private sphere. But we are losing the will and the wherewithal to maintain that. The alternative is a self-sufficiency that's more than many communities can afford. Second, the assumption about keeping distance from the poor is unsustainable. The major flaw in the local control argument was the notion that people of a municipality actually have control over what happens locally. We're learning now that that simply isn't true. We live in regions. A neighbor in decline affects us all. A declining region is less competitive than a more robust and equitable one. Negative externalities are not some academic theory. They reflect laws of fiscal, political, and moral interdependency. So rather than making policies that simply move low-income people around from one opportunity-poor place to another, paying rising public costs along the way, it would make infinitely more sense to distribute communities of opportunity across entire regions, spreading the burdens and benefits more equitably and reducing the costs borne disproportionately by any unlucky ones. And third, it is clear that the structure of local government law has worked to reproduce racial and economic segregation behind the cover of colorblindness and fiscal prudence. The result is an ever-sprawling landscape of abandoned communities and institutions in favor of new ones in our green fields and our green spaces. The result is a costly waste of diminishing state economic resources that strain tax capacity and hurt middle-class taxpayers. And worst of all, continued segregation concentrates poverty in first-tier suburbs with the fewest resources available to stabilize families. Imagine what our communities might look like had we acted long ago on an entirely different assumption. What if we had made the radical assumption that what was good for the poor was probably good for the middle class? Well, we would have more productivity and probably a lot less poverty. And what poverty we had would be shorter and less damaging to mind, body, spirit, and community. Finally, I'd like to conclude my time with you this morning by saying something about the remedies available to us. The purpose of this gathering is to stimulate discussion of specific policy planning, so I will not attempt to offer details. Instead, I'd like to suggest that our history demands significant reform, transformative change, the kind of structural realignments that follow a rejection of old, destructive assumptions. The way forward depends on our willingness to embrace a principle of mutuality in our policies, to see our fates as directly and indirectly intertwined, to look for fairness and equity, and to find it as often as we can across jurisdictional borders. Martin Luther King Jr., writing from Birmingham jail, said, "We live in inescapable networks of mutuality." Well, we have spent a long time in active disregard for that observation. We have assumed we could be saved by one more shopping mall, one last office park, one less multi-family apartment building. The jig appears to be up. The nation's unmistakable demographic movement toward a non-white majority makes escape from the network impossible except for the very rich, and undesirable as it relates to our most cherished ideals. We're running out of land and natural resources to run to or to use up. The gating of our communities has only cost us more. We can no longer afford ourselves, and we can't do it alone. We have little choice but to do it together, and I believe we can. Thank you very much.